Okay. Hello. 28 April, dis&datInformation. Today, I'm going to read the translation, the preface by the translators for a book by Guillaume Suing, Suing, that just came out, Communism, the Highest Stage of Ecology. And there are two translators, Henry Hakamaki and Salvatore Engel di Moro. Um, the translators forward reflections on socialism and environmental protection by the translators, and then if there's enough time, I'll get all the way up to the first chapter. We not sure whether we'll continue beyond that, but I have included the table of contents for anyone who wants very specific chapters ahead. The beauty, of course, of the publisher is that they provide free PDF versions of this in order to maximize, contact. So it's very exciting, and particularly because it's a new book, and it's the first time translated into English from French. And it does represent a kind of position. It, if you want to sort of oversimplify it, it is this the idea of red and green, and the author does comment on that as well as some other interesting ideas that are important relative to the reasons why we look at things like Lasorda's book on Stalin and the critique of Western Marxism and all that sort of stuff. So you can see the flavor of that sort of in the text. All right. Translators forward, reflections on socialism and environmental protection. In the face of escalating environmental crises, the urgent need for a paradigm shift in humanity's relationship with the rest of nature has become increasingly apparent. The interplay between social and environmental justice is a topic of profound significance, especially when considering the historical and theoretical frameworks that have informed our understanding of these issues. Yet, despite this, hegemonic narratives around the supposed destructive nature of communism on the environment pervade and inhibit exploration of radical alternatives to the truly destructive capitalist world system we are already living in. The work of French scholar Guillaume Suing, now translated into English for the first time, offers a timely and insightful contribution to this discourse and aims to shatter these hegemonic narratives that have been implanted into popular consciousness as a means of stifling, if not subverting, revolutionary fervor in the environmental movement. Communism, the highest stage of ecology, is a meticulously researched and powerfully argued analysis that challenges these hegemonic narratives surrounding communism and environmentalism, revealing a rich tapestry of interconnections that have long been overlooked or misunderstood. This introduction aims to provide a synthesis of the key arguments presented in the book, highlighting the relevance of a dialectical materialist perspective in addressing the pressing ecological concerns of our time. The text's narrative begins with a preface by Victor Dedage that underscores the imperative of socialist planning in the context of energy and environmental policies. Drawing upon the experiences of various socialist and capitalist countries, Dedage critically examines the strategic and tactical choices made by these systems. The distinction between transitional and long-term energy strategies is crucial as it reflects the underlying priorities and constraints inherent in each system. Socialist countries striving for independence and development have often pursued the establishment of sovereignty over energy systems to break free from the shackles of imperialist control. The book argues that only socialist planning can effectively address the looming fossil fuel shortage and contribute to global environmental protection in the long run. This analysis is set against the backdrop of quote unquote green capitalism, which is critiqued for its potential to serve as a tool for maintaining the status quo and hindering the development of emerging powers such as China, Russia, Brazil, and India. The historical and political implications of energy provision strategies are thus situated within the broader context of national sovereignty and social transformation. The concept of productivism, quote unquote, which is central to the critique of capitalism's environmental record, is also a focal point of the book. Certainly, socialist countries, especially the USSR and the PRC, have been accused of productivism, both from the right and left. Suing engages with the perspectives of environmental activists, communists, and socialists, dissecting the nuances of this term and its relation to energy choices. Productivism, as traditionally understood, involves the relentless pursuit of economic growth through increased production and technological innovation, often at the expense of environmental considerations. However, the author shows that a dialectical approach can reveal the complexities of this concept, describing how it has been shaped by the specific conditions of each society and the historical epochs in which it has been applied. The transitional nature of socialist economies is underscored as they grapple with the legacy of underdevelopment and the imperatives of modernization, while simultaneously striving to achieve a harmonious balance with the environment. This is why the charge of productivism against socialist states is out of place. When such accusation comes from pro-capitalist environmentalists, it is tantamount to projection, since it is an inexhaustible hunger for profit that drives productivism. Chapter 1 delves into the concrete example of Cuba's agroecological revolution. This case study exemplifies how socialist planning can lead to sustainable agriculture and environmental protection. Cuba's nationalization of resources, particularly agricultural resources, has allowed for the funding of comprehensive education and health systems, which in turn have supported the development of agroecological practices. The chapter highlights Cuba's success in achieving food sovereignty, increasing agricultural production, and ensuring equitable social distribution, all while maximizing seed biodiversity and employing organic farming techniques for, among others, soil health improvement and pest control. Cuba's commitment to political independence and environmental conservation is also underscored, with significant investments in renewable energy and the expansion of forested areas and protected species. Given the high rate of urbanization in Cuba, cities have not been exempted from the process. Cuba, as a direct result of coordination among multiple segments of society and the socialization of the means of production, have turned into a world leader in ecologically sustainable urban farming techniques and production levels, along with successes in creating synergies between town and country. Thereby, socialism, as developed in Cuba, prefigures degrowth in practice. It demonstrates a pathway toward achieving degrowth in its leftist understanding, reducing throughputs while increasing living standards. Moving on to discussing the Soviet Union, Chapter 2 provides a historical analysis of agricultural practices and policies, particularly in the period of the Stalin administration following the Second World War. Suing documents the complexities of the Soviet Union's approach to agriculture, characterized by the tension between intensive production and the preservation of individual plots for personal use, as well as tensions over the use of biological or chemical agricultural methods, methods that were hotly debated within the halls of Soviet academies. The chapter also delves into the ideological clashes within the scientific community, notably the confrontation between Trofim Lysenko's proletarian science and the more Western-oriented scientific approaches of the time. The Lysenko affair, while often vilified in the West, is presented as a reflection of the broader struggle to reconcile the imperatives of socialist development with the demands of scientific truth and environmental stewardship. The Khrushchev-led descent into an ecologically more destructive path tied to a policy of catching up to the U.S. farming model exemplifies one outcome of this struggle, which is discussed in Chapter 2 as a contrast to what happened in Cuba. Suing's insightful and comparative discussion underscores the need for a dialectical understanding that transcends simplistic dichotomies of East versus West, tradition versus innovation, and productivism versus conservation. The third chapter of the book takes us into the realm of life itself, exploring the fundamental contradictions of heredity and evolution through the lens of epigenetics. Here, the dialectical materialist approach is essential in making sense of the intricate dance between self-preservation and the mechanisms that drive species to diversify and evolve. The historical and ideological confrontations within the field of ecology are laid bare, as the author contends that for a true synthesis of ecological thought, Marxist methodology must be embraced. The need for a collective endeavor to re-envision our future is emphasized, one that transcends the limitations of both scientific disciplines and political ideologies. The conclusion of the book brings us back to the contemporary landscape of environmental politics, addressing the fraught relationship between communism and ecology. The author identifies the historical misunderstandings that have divided these two movements and advocates for a genuine integration capable of overcoming the conceptual impasses that have hindered their unity. The text critically assesses the limitations of eco-socialism generally and calls for a deeper engagement with Marxist thought, especially of the sort that has evolved in socialist countries to inform environmental policy. It challenges the dichotomy of progress and degrowth, suggesting that a revolutionary orientation is necessary to transcend the limitations imposed by the capitalist mode of production. The unprecedented nature of the ecological crisis is underscored, as many in future generations may have to live more modestly than their ancestors, many of whom already live in devastated environments under threats of disasters and in conditions of chronic deprivation. Communism, the highest stage of ecology, is a critical intervention in the debate surrounding the compatibility of socialist and environmentalist agendas. It demonstrates that the core principles of communism, collective ownership of the means of production, democratic planning, and the centrality of human and environmental well-being, are not only compatible with, but also necessary for a sustainable ecological future. By examining historical examples and engaging with the complexities of scientific knowledge, the author provides a compelling argument for the potential of socialist systems to lead the way in addressing the current environmental challenges. The book is particularly relevant in an era where the limitations of market-based solutions to environmental issues are becoming increasingly evident even in the mainstream. The neoliberal model of quote-unquote green capitalism has been shown to be insufficient in addressing the systemic causes of ecological degradation. Instead, a radical rethinking of our relationship with nature is required, one that acknowledges the interdependence of social justice, and environmental justice. Suing's work suggests that this is not only possible, but also historically and theoretically grounded in the principles of communism. So where does this leave us? How should revolutionary scholars and activists alike make use of this text? Suing's work serves as a clarion call to integrate ecological concerns into the very fabric of our socialist projects, drawing from what has already been accomplished historically in socialist countries. It is a reminder that the struggle for a better world is not merely an economic or political endeavor, but also a profoundly ecological one. By embracing a dialectical understanding of the complexities inherent in environmental policy and practice, we can forge a path forward that is both scientifically rigorous and ideologically sound. One could start from numerous entry points to achieve this. One that we have found particularly inspiring with respect to the current conjuncture is the development and spread of agroecologically informed farming in Cuba. Suing ably recounts the success attained so far in raising food productivity in both town and country. It could be added as well that the advances made in linking and coordinating food production in both urban and rural areas. All the while, the relative progress in raising the level of nutritious food access to all Cubans has been reached while minimizing negative impacts, if not even bringing about improvements in ecosystem health, especially in urban ecosystems. The need to add that the successes have been relative is due to the brutal U.S. blockade now exceeding 60 years and intensifying, as well as the great efforts that have had to be devoted toward overcoming centuries of Spanish and U.S. colonialism and associated plantation systems, subtended as they were by genocides and slavery systems. The objective conditions of capitalist imperialism, imperialist siege, and colonial histories must always be borne in mind when assessing the environmental and social records of socialist countries. The fact that in Cuba such strides have been by way of agroecology, urban food production, and reconciling town and country food production systems points to the decisive advantages of applying Marxist principles to guide the biophysical sciences with the support of a socialist state, without which no such progress is achievable. Examples of the socialist state's key role in improving lives, as well as eventually and necessarily raising a society's ecological sustainability level, can also be found where socialist revolutions have been crushed. Burkina Faso features importantly, even if fleetingly, in Suing's discussion of a successful implementation of ecologically mindful policies under socialism, working out solutions in parallel with Cuba during roughly the same time period. For similar reasons, Burkina Faso would have headed in similar directions as Cuba had it not been for the 1987 French colonial intervention in backing a violent coup, installing a dictatorship only overthrown by 2014. This experience of agroecology in an effort to establish food security flies directly in the face of what the bulwarks of the imperialist capitalist world system foster their self and aggrandizing actions, political, economic, and food insecurity in the global periphery. Take, for example, the way that Western development scholars, analysts, and consultants lecture developing countries on how to develop their economies through resource extraction and the selling of primary commodities with the aim of developing other industries in the future. What does this look like in practice? Among other impacts is the overfocusing on extraction, which leads to massive distortions of national economies, often leading to a sidelining of agricultural production. For instance, in the case of Nigeria, a major oil boom took place beginning in the 1960s and continued its acceleration through the 1970s. However, at the same time, the amount of cultivated land in the country decreased by a disconcerting 60% in just the period of 1975 to 78. Furthermore, entire regions like the Niger Delta were effectively taken out of agricultural production as a result of lasting pollution from oil and gas extraction, involving the assassination of local activists such as Kensaro Wiwa, who dared to oppose the systematic upending of their lands. The result of this was a once food self-sufficient country having to turn to food imports, to the extent that Nigeria was importing over $1 billion annually in rice alone. Without food sovereignty, political sovereignty is also always a tenuous line to hold at the moment that a developing country reaches a crisis point. The imperialist West sees more opportunities for extraction and exploitation. As Henry Kissinger candidly put it, quote, to give food aid to a country just because they're starving is a pretty weak reason, unquote. A neo-colonized country in crisis to imperialists is simply more fodder for capitalist accumulation. The Burkinabe revolutionaries analyzed the imperialist system brilliantly and took steps informed by Cuba's ongoing experimentation to seek not only political sovereignty, but also ecologically sensitive food sovereignty. It is no wonder then that a Western-backed coup cut this project short. Think of the threat that sovereignty in the global periphery poses to the imperialist core. As a more recent example, take the case of Niger, a country that within the last year has begun revoking French licenses at uranium mines in the country. This is a country in which only 19% of the population has access to electricity, yet whose uranium covers 30% of France's civilian needs and 100% of France's military needs, and which produces huge profits within France. This relationship is exactly that which the Burkinabe revolutionaries were not only criticizing, but were struggling against. No wonder that the Alliance of Sahel states is portrayed in witheringly negative light within the media apparatuses of the imperial core. Nevertheless, despite the twisting of narratives by imperialists in both this contemporary example and the historical examples that this book analyzes, the Burkinabe experiment and Cuba's revolutionary agroecological experimentation remain shining examples of what can be attempted when the shackles of capitalist imperialism are shorn and a new political and economic horizon can be explored. Communism, the highest stage of ecology, is a germinal work that not only contributes to the theoretical debate on the relationship between communism and environmentalism, but also provides practical insights into the strategies and policies that can lead to a sustainable future. Guillaume Suing's combined historical analysis, scientific inquiry, and political critique offers a refreshing perspective that challenges readers to think critically about the future of our planet and the systems that govern it. This book is a useful tool for those seeking to break the hegemonic narratives that have dominated discussions of environmental policy and to build a world that prioritizes the common good over the short-term interests of the few. That's the forward done by the translators, Hakamaki and Demoro. And this is the original forward by Victor Dedage. In the beginning, there was the tomato. Then they made the shitty tomato. And instead of calling it the shitty tomato, they called it tomato. While the tomato, the one that tasted like a tomato and had grown as such, became the quote unquote organic tomato. From then on, it was all downhill. So, you would like to save the planet. I can understand you well. It would be a shame to do without it. So I do what you do. I pay attention. To what? That depends on my level of awareness and commitment. When I bought my 4x4, I made sure it came with a catalytic converter and big rubber tires and leather seats and lots of metal and plastic all around. I'm also careful to use only clean gas, the kind you extract with a feather duster and white gloves. When I take it to the supermarket to do my shopping, I only buy products stamped organic, like these freshly hand-picked fruits flown to my plate. Oh, yes, and I also sort my garbage. It's amazing how much waste we produce. In short, I'm all about ecology, sustainable development, and all that. Even capitalism has gone green. According to the law of supply and demand, all you have to do is demand. That's it. On a more serious note, there was a time not so long ago when we heard with horror how megacities were suffocating under a blanket of pollution. But here we are at the beginning of the 21st century, and pollution alerts now punctuate our days. What horrified us only a short time ago has become our daily routine. Bulletins announcing how breathable the air is, vegetables that no longer taste of anything, suffocating transport, and unlivable megacities, as if these simple observations weren't enough to convince everyone of the urgency of the situation. Now we've got to sound the alarm too. Relying on capitalism to save our environment is like relying on arms dealers to ensure world peace. Of course, one will say that capitalism is no fool, and its interest is the same as ours, that is, survival. Which presupposes a minimum of interest in the long or medium term or in collective well-being. And clever as it is, capitalism drapes itself in green, looking for ways to take advantage of this belated awareness. But between questioning the consumer society to save the air and the opportunity to boost consumption by selling gas masks made from recycled products, it goes without saying, what do you think capitalism will naturally choose? And if you've never heard of the head of a multinational food company recently declaring that he sees no reason why access to drinking water should be a right, it's probably because you've been reading the wrong newspaper. And as with any well thought out scam, the first thing to do is control the narrative. But what do you do when history contradicts narrative? You've probably guessed it. Simply rewrite history. And that's how, let's put it schematically, ecology came into being in our part of the world during the 1970s as a quote unquote apolitical movement, an indicative choice for those in the know. A sort of quote unquote meta movement that proclaimed itself as you prefer, outside, above, or alongside parties and ideologies, a veritable eruption on the political scene of a quote unquote response to a quote unquote new and unforeseen problem. Yes, unforeseen, because who could have imagined before that capitalism would lead us through the dynamics of its internal logic towards a preordained catastrophe? Who knows? Perhaps understood by those who had long ago analyzed this dynamic and had thought up alternatives. Rewriting history means reinventing the past, but it also means concealing part of the present. Like, for example, the reality of a large Caribbean island that has managed to plan, remember that word, plan, the redesign of its development to become the one and only example in the world, still to this day, of a concrete model of sustainable development. Now, if you've never heard of it, it's probably because you haven't been reading the right newspaper. In this book, Guillaume Suing has taken up the welcome initiative of setting a few things straight and overturning a number of preconceived ideas, helping us to rediscover past thinkers that some would have us forget and lift the veil on a certain present that the same people would have us ignore. That's the prior preface done by Victor Dadash. This is the introduction to the Suing text. It's a quote from Aeschylus. Did you not see the helpless infirmity, no better than a dream, in which the blind generation of men is shackled? Never shall the counsels of mortal men transgress the ordering of Zeus. The fact that green joins red on the flags of today's left reflects both a step forward in the unity of the militant anti-capitalist front and a kind of political misunderstanding that neither the environmentalists nor indeed the communists seem to want to dispel. The relative youth of political ecology and its social base partly explain why its anti-capitalist character is only just emerging today. But the disqualification of illusions linked to the trend towards green capitalism and the Marxization of what we usually call eco-socialism is a recent and still yet largely unfinished business. Translators note the term eco-socialist has differing meanings inside and outside particular Marxist tendencies and schools of thought. Throughout this text, suing is using it to mean to movements, i.e., the Fourth Internationalists in France, like Lowy, mainly intellectual in nature, that unite environmentalism and political struggle, or views environmental issues as political, albeit in abstracted and utopian ways. These movements typically avoid questions of the practicalities of political power, the realities of bringing about meaningful ecological restoration, and have the tendency to be dismissive of, if not antagonistic to, socialist countries. Another term for these could be utopian environmentalism. The communist movement, for its part, seems to be getting used to a defensive position in the face of this new green social democratic spirit, including in terms of concepts, when on the contrary, it should be taking the lead and fighting on the ideological front, drawing unashamedly from the Soviet heritage. This was not only theoretical, but also to a large extent practical, as explained below. It is in total contradiction with the preconceptions of today's green activists. Until the 1950s, for over 30 years, the USSR was the world's most advanced country in the field of ecology, not only in its ability to protect the environment, but also in its choice of agricultural techniques. And this was no accident. The proponents of eco-socialism themselves concede that only socialism, triumphant over the anarchy of production and private property that characterizes the capitalist system, can properly and harmoniously manage agricultural production and environmental production on a national scale. While political ecology does everything it can to distance itself from a Marxism deemed productivist or even Promethean, the aim here is to demonstrate how, from a theoretical, historical, and practical point of view, socialism is the highest stage of what has come to be called ecology, and not a supposed political adversary. The political foundations of eco-socialism are curiously reminiscent of the first anarchist and utopian socialist conceptions of the 19th century. Today, in contrast, it's a question of overcoming the apparent contradiction between productivism and environmentalism, because the need to develop agricultural and industrial production to meet the needs of a rapidly growing population is not necessarily opposed to nature, quote unquote. For those who don't recall, Prometheus is the name of a titan who stole the fire of knowledge from Zeus and gave it to humans. And footnote 5, Lenin's famous Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, demonstrated both how the imperialist stage was a necessary development of capitalism and how it was the ultimate one. Thus, by analogy, we use the term highest stage. Political ecology, i.e., the struggle to protect the environment, necessarily involves the question of political power, which can only be completely resolved under and through socialism, i.e., by eliminating the domination exercised by the bourgeoisie, which is largely responsible for current environmental disasters. Like the Carnots of Lyon, who, in the early days of the proletariat struggle, attacked machine tools accused of destroying jobs, environmentalists divert the very real contradiction between capital and nature in favor of a very idealistic and insurmountable contradiction between nature and technical progress. Perhaps imperfectly and within the limits imposed by imperialist encirclement, only the Soviets came up with techniques for overcoming this contradiction without the pre-industrial petty bourgeois nostalgia that characterizes ecology today. Now, of course, one might object to Chernobyl, the Aral Sea, DDT pollution of Moldavian soils, but it is a misunderstanding of history encouraged by the West that prevents communists from retorting or confines them to a defensive nihilistic attitude with arguments that are more often than not ineffective. Let's be clear. The USSR was only belatedly subjected to intensive agriculture with its well-known setbacks in terms of environmental protection. It was under Khrushchev, and not before, that the USSR chose to compete with the triumphant United States of America in spite of the Marxist-Leninist theory that had prevailed until then, by using the same methods and the same rules of the game. From then on, the socialist camp aligned itself more and more openly and resolutely with the capitalist tendencies of short-termist, soil-destroying intensive agriculture. As for the problems linked to energy policy, of which the nuclear issue is a particularly debated outgrowth today, will also show how communism can overcome them without falling back into the fundamental contradiction pointed out by Marx and Engels, associated with that of capital-labor, namely the capital-nature contradiction. Translator's note, Kanu, that is Kanu, bear canes, alluding to their poverty level, were silk workers in places like Lyon, France, who organized and revolted against horrid working conditions in 1831 and again in 1834, and were slaughtered in their hundreds by French armies. The uprising were, in some respects, a prelude to the 1848 rebellion in Lyon that coincided with other rebellions throughout Europe. Next section, from utopian eco-socialism to scientific socialism. Eco-socialists criticize the communism they claim to surpass for deriving its excessive productivism from a skewed interpretation of Marx and Engels, which ultimately resembles that of capitalists. But this quote unquote degrowth critique of Marx is not new. And while it clearly distances itself today from the illusions of the quote unquote green capitalism movement, the identified enemy is less the bourgeoisie than human nature, which is intrinsically irresponsible in the face of technical progress, irrespective of any class struggle. We end up glorifying the model of small, self sufficient, inward looking communities, a kind of fantasized return to the phalanstery area, or it's a phalanstery era, even a primitive communism. In today's eco-socialist programs, we find an emphasis on quote unquote family farming, on small units, as opposed to mass production, as if the latter necessarily went hand in hand with the disasters we have known since the second half of the 20th century. As we shall see, while this model is not absurd in absolute terms at the stage called communism, the final disappearance of the state following the political work of the proletariat during the transitional stage of socialism, it must be remembered that achieving it without transition, starting from a capitalist system of class struggle, is by definition impossible. This is where communists fundamentally differ from anarchists or social democrats claiming to be eco-socialists, for whom the socialist stage, that is, the dictatorship of the proletariat, is clearly neither necessary nor desirable. Now, in footnote 7, there's a translator's note. Since original publication, there's been a lively debate around the meaning and political expediency of the term degrowth. In this text, it is used in relation to the school of thought which argues that environmentally sustainable civilization can only be achieved with a return to a bucolic and romanticized past. Equally, these movements also argue for an unqualified reduction in all forms of consumption and commit the same but inverted error of the capitalists, that of not differentiating use values and exchange values. There exists a wide body of perspectives now fighting for ownership of the appellation degrowth. And there's a text that has just come out, Engel de Moro's Eco-Socialism, analyzes those tendencies. And we'll get onto that one eventually. Translator's note 8, a phalanstery or phalanstery refers to a self-contained community living in harmony and holding property in common as idealized by utopian socialists like Charles Fourier. At the same time, it should be noted that fascist currents are opportunistically taking advantage of this new environmentalist trend with anti-communist and Malthusian overtones, mythologizing nature and its spirituality, pining for feudalism, corporatism, and the supposedly unchanging social and natural balances that have now been desecrated by stateless financial tycoons. So here we are, back to the old polemics of Proudhon against Marx, a far cry from the supposed overcoming of Marxism. And while some are still desperately seeking a quote unquote third way between capitalism and communism through a quote unquote gray-green temptation, others are forced to quote unquote re-examine Marxism by trying to articulate it with considerations that Marxism would not spontaneously encompass. Eco-socialism, in fact, reflects an impatient, petty bourgeois, anti-dialectical aspiration, similar to yesterday's hypercritical calls to quote-unquote synthesize Marxism with feminism, anti-racism, anti-fascism, or anti-imperialism, as if the link were not obvious. Was it not thanks to the socialist camp, directly or indirectly, that civil rights were granted to struggling African Americans in the USA for fear of the development of Bolshevism? Wasn't it thanks to the October Revolution that the right to vote and to stand for election was granted to African Americans for fear of a rising Bolshevism? Wasn't it thanks to the October Revolution that the rights to vote and stand for elections were granted to women? In Soviet Russia, for example, the right to vote was fully granted for the first time in 1918, Or in France, for example, it was only granted in 1944. Fascism, meanwhile, was defeated in the 1940s in Europe by communist-led popular fronts and then by the Soviet Union itself against the Third Reich in the Second World War, or the Great Patriotic War. And this other little footnote was interesting to me. Finland was the first country to guarantee women the right to vote in 1906, but only in parliamentary elections. Municipal elections, for example, remained subject to suffrage based on tax qualification. The first successful national liberation struggles subsequently were hard won in the wake of Vietnamese communist victories over French and American colonialists. There's a certain hypocrisy in wanting to regenerate Marxism by associating it with some exogenous auxiliary, be it feminism, anti-racism, anti-fascism, anti-imperialism, or ecology. We'll see that far from being a gap in dialectical materialist analysis and the practice of scientific socialism, ecology is, on the contrary, consubstantial with them. This is not to say that the partial struggles mentioned here have no raison d'etre. On the contrary, they're often central to the struggle. We enter the general struggle against capitalism with our own motives at the outset. For the woman oppressed by feudal mentality, as for the indigenous person squeezed by a French multinational, or the African American victim of daily police repression. But the mass nature of these struggles, such as those waged by activists against junk food, for example, logically converge when it comes to uniting to defeat the common capitalist enemy and establish a new system that would guarantee everyone's rights with a certain degree of stability. If the Soviet Union once strove to protect the environment and transform it while respecting its equilibrium, if Cuba still stands out today for its ability to use its soil and energy resources while winning the admiration of Western environmentalists, it is not by chance or by some tactical concession designed to please the latter, but by a theoretical and practical necessity linked to their mode of production, even if it is productivist. Next section, protecting nature, a matter for scientists, not shamans. Basically, the anti-productivist principle of the ecology, environmentalist movement, stems from a philosophical presupposition about an idealized nature, which can only be desecrated by human labor, contrasting human progress with technical progress. Yet the history of humanity is first and foremost that of the domestication of its environment, the founding act of which was the Neolithic Revolution. And there's a translator's note, footnote 13. In a European context, the ecology movement does not refer to a scientific field, but to a socially wider environmental movement. In the text, ecology and environmental movements are terms that are used interchangeably, just to give you a sense of what's going on. Prehistory is marked by the transition from hunter-gatherer tribes to sedentary human groups who domesticated plants and animals to meet their basic needs by attaining greater security, regularity, and quantity of necessities. They were the protagonists of the first quote-unquote great plan for the transformation of nature, unquote, without which horses, cows, sheep, wheat, barley, and 1,000 other humanly shaped creatures would not exist today. For millennia, this radical transformation of the human environment spread across the planet, defying the fears of shamans terrorized by the imminence of celestial vengeance. Humanity itself has been transformed in return, particularly in eating habits and metabolic adaptations without the sky ever falling. First of all, we need to distinguish how human transformations of the environment can alter major natural balances without compromising the long-term ability to satisfy human needs for food or energy. In other words, we need to identify the extent to which the necessary modifications to our living environment are linked to the satisfaction of our needs, our vital interests, that is, the quantity and quality of our food, renewal of the energy needed for our activities, or alternatively, to the quest for maximum profit characteristic of the capitalist system. Then it's a matter of demonstrating how it is the working class, the basis of material production, and whose historical role is to defeat the capitalist system in order to satisfy both its own interests and, by extension, those of all humanity, that must be in the vanguard of the struggle against this parasitic bourgeois class that is leading us to our ruin, including with respect to our natural resources. It's at these two levels that we need to understand both the anti-productivism and anti-communism of the early ecology movement right up to its eco-socialist mutation. While the latter is an objective advance in terms of the convergence of anti-capitalist struggles, it retains a dangerously divisive potential when it comes to cascading a particular strategic option of states fighting for national sovereignty against predatory imperialism, a particular struggle for the jobs of workers in today's industry, or even a particular picket line from which the black, toxic fumes of burning tires escape. Marx exposes this with clairvoyance, intimately linking the two struggles without calling into question the famous disembodied productivism. All progress in capitalistic agriculture is a progress in the art, not only of robbing the laborer, but of robbing the soil. All progress in increasing the fertility of the soil for a given time is a progress toward ruining the lasting sources of that fertility. The more a country starts its development on the foundation of modern industry, like the United States, for example, the more rapid is this process of destruction. Capitalist production, therefore, develops technology and the combining together of various processes into a social whole only by sapping the original sources of all wealth, the soil and the labor. It would therefore be possible and obviously desirable, according to Marx, to develop production techniques without increasing the ruin of such sustainable resources. Engels was even more precise in pointing out the capitalist responsibility for the irrational destruction of the environment. 150 years before the first eco-socialists appeared, he asserted, quote, as individual capitalists are engaged in production and exchange for the sake of the immediate profit, only the nearest, most immediate results must first be taken into account. As long as the individual manufacturer or merchant sells a manufactured or purchased commodity with the usual coveted profit, he is satisfied and does not concern himself with what afterwards becomes of the commodity and its purchasers. The same thing applies to the natural effects of the same actions. What cared to the Spanish planters in Cuba, who burned down forests on the slopes of the mountains and obtained from the ashes sufficient fertilizer for one generation of a very profitable coffee trees, what cared they that the heavy tropical rainfall afterwards washed away the unprotected upper stratum of the soil, leaving only bare rock? In relation to nature as to society, the present mode of production is predominantly concerned only about the immediate, the most tangible result, and then surprise is expressed that the more remote effects of actions directed to this end turn out to be quite different and are mostly quite the opposite in character, that the harmony of supply and demand is transformed into the very opposite, or the very reverse opposite. Lenin, need we add, was no more productivist than his inspirers and shared their views, reminding us, for example, that the possibility of substituting artificial fertilizers for natural ones in no way refutes the irrationality of wasting natural fertilizers by polluting rivers and the air in industrial districts. While the fight to protect the environment logically follows from anti-capitalist struggles, it never refers to any instinct on the part of humans to produce and pollute in a fatal, headlong rush inherent to their very nature. If productivism is defined by a quest for maximum profit, the foundation of capitalism, how can we label its antagonist socialism? On the contrary, only science, as permanent human work in the field of knowledge and techniques, enables societies to prevent the long-term degradation of resources that could be exploited spontaneously, immediately, and to the end, when this degradation is not perceptible on the scale of isolated individuals. Here again, we will demonstrate how the socialist system outperforms the capitalist system, not only in theory, but above all, and consequently in practice, when it comes to implementing reasonable strategies that respect natural resources. On a practical level, we know to what extent the capitalist system privileges and finances the most lucrative sectors of research with the aim of quickly satisfying its thirst for maximum profit. On the contrary, it holds back less immediately profitable sectors, or if it wishes to develop them, it proves incapable of injecting sufficient funds. Unless, for example, it wishes to compete with the Soviet pioneer in the aerospace race, so long as the latter was threatening its hegemony. From a theoretical point of view, the brakes imposed by the bourgeois pensée unique are notorious among agronomists who have tried to dissent. Claude Bourguignon, an agronomist and lecturer well known for having reintroduced biology into the debates of agricultural professionals, which had been up till then conditioned by chemistry alone, that is, artificial fertilizers and pesticides from agro-industry, testifies to the disappearance in France in the 1970s of chairs in soil microbiology at university and the impossibility of fighting against the lobbies of chemically intensive agriculture within the INRA, the French National Agronomic Research Institute. Clearly, as long as the state exists, that is, as long as the class struggle exists, it is never indifferent to the scientific research it funds. But it is also the dominant ideology disseminated by this state throughout society that determines, even more than funding, the work of theoretical production. In this sense, we shall see that dialectical materialism, the dominant paradigm under socialism, was able to move away from Western aspirations for short-termist intensive agriculture in favor of a much more ecological integrationist vision of the environment, the living world, and even the soil. Next section, behind degrowth, the reactionary Malthus. The neglect of historical sources is quite symptomatic of the environmentalist movement. As it was Karl Marx who first spoke of sustainable development, there's a trace of willful obliviousness deeply rooted in the thinking of environmentalists and even, in a way, of eco-socialists. As nature abhors a vacuum, this neglectfulness defaults into Malthusianism. Malthus, the 19th century economist, made a name for himself with his controversy over birth control. In the midst of the rise of industrial capitalism, this Anglican bourgeois transposed to human demography a typical business angst linked to the cyclical nature of economic crises of overproduction. A man who is born into a world already possessed, if he cannot get subsistence from his parents, on whom he has a just demand, and if the society do not want his labor, has no right, no claim of right to the smallest portion of food, and in fact has no business to be where he is. At nature's mighty feast, there is no variant cover for him. She tells him to be gone and will quickly execute her own orders if he does not work upon the compassions of some of her guests. If these guests get up and make room for him, other intruders immediately appear demanding the same favor. The report of a provision for all that come fills the hall with numerous claimants. Got to stop him at the border. The order and harmony of the feast is disturbed. In other words, against Marx and others, Malthus claimed that population was increasing exponentially while available resources were only increasing arithmetically, i.e., much more slowly. This principle, which underpins the harshest and most inhumane voluntarist regulations, still prevails, as we understand it, not only in the anti-immigration conceptions of Western reactionaries, but also, and this is more surprising, in those of environmentalists concerned with the planet's available resources, starting with those of the soil and subsoil. Now, while it is true that non-renewable energies are anti-environmental, we'll come back to this point, we need to start combating the caricatures that have been perpetuated for too long in this field, even if they are quote-unquote common sense, knowing that they allow part of the quote-unquote left to condemn, along with capital, economic growth and an improvement in living standards to which the peoples of the South, and in particular China and India, are deemed not to be entitled. That is, meat consumption, improved public health and lower mortality, development of means of transport, and so on. Malnutrition worldwide is declining as a proportion of the world's population. In other words, thanks in particular to technological progress, that is, instant worldwide circulation of information on declared famines leading to almost immediate food supplies, except in areas of armed conflict, and then there's USAID, nutritional deficiencies due to a real lack of local resources are diminishing. In 1990, it was estimated that 15.4 of the world's 5.3 billion people were undernourished. In 2000, the figure was 13.5 for 6.1 billion. In 2015, the figure was 9.1% for 7.3 billion, and forecasts estimate it will be at 6.7% for 8.3 billion in 2030. The idea that explosive population growth would lead to the depletion of food resources is false, both because of scientific progress and because of spontaneous birth rate regulation when steady state is reached for different peoples. Of course, voluntary birth control is possible, but it is primarily linked to national limits and never to global limits, since demographic growth more or less follows that of the means of production, themselves linked to technical and scientific progress. We might even add that the increase in the ecological footprint, i.e., the ecological cost or indebtedness of human populations on environmental resources, is much greater in the Northern Hemisphere, where populations are growing very slowly, than in the Southern Hemisphere, where populations are growing much faster. Thus, food shortages are fully linked to the degree of exploitation of peoples by imperialism, and even to the wars it provokes, and food riots such as the historic ones in 2008. Another editor's note, in, for example, Cameroon, Egypt, and up to 30 countries in total were linked to financial speculation on the world's agricultural resources and in no way to the overpopulation the Malthus warned against. Of course, in absolute terms, we could argue that the planet is not inexhaustible and could not support hundreds of billions of humans, but we're a long way from that. And we need to reason on our timescale to guarantee political effectiveness. The idea of limiting births rather than fighting the system that impoverishes us comes directly from Malthusian anxiety about this great banquet of nature where newcomers would have to be denied at all costs what had been granted to the first arrivals. If environmentalists endorse the openly Malthusian conceptions of major global organizations such as WWF, not the wrestlers, it is at best due to an ideological effect. WWF is the World Wildlife Fund. The only factor limiting food resources in relation to world population growth is not so much the world's arable land as the alteration of its fertility, linked, as we shall see in detail, to the suicidal techniques of intensive capitalist agriculture. In many ways, capitalism's overexploitation of the soil since the Second World War is reminiscent of the overexploitation of the quote-unquote invisible colonial peoples, providing a Western labor aristocracy with the crumbs it needs to purposely nurture social peace in the heart of the metropolis. To the last degree, the barbaric pursuit of profit has, in the history of capitalism, and under very specific conditions, led to a headlong rush to exploit labor without any concern for regenerating the workforce. In the Nazi labor camps, inmates were pressed to death, with human losses regularly renewed by the arrival of fresh recruits. In periods of adjustment of the capitalist system, it took a long period of trial and error for the blind development of capitalist exploitation to concede rights and more livable conditions to workers through workers' struggles so that they can reconstitute their workforce over the longer term. We sense that this blind development, still present today and still also exerted on the soil's resources, is not immediately resisted this time by nature, and it is therefore difficult to regulate. Indeed, agricultural soils must regenerate in the long term, otherwise they'll be permanently depleted. And this exhaustion is not immediately reflected in natural resistance. The only resistance that will enable green capitalism, which it is inevitably forced to continue its race for profit in the long term, will be that of the peasantry, greatly weakened, and environmental activists, essentially from the petty bourgeoisie. Genuine, sustainable protection of the planet means first and foremost identifying the troublemaker, not overpopulation or rising living standards in the South, but the global capitalist system. The alternative to this catastrophe is not agricultural degrowth, but a technical revolution that only the socialist system can plan. We're not talking about a return to small family units, but about the revolutionary transformation of large-scale farming techniques based on the deliberately overlooked experience of socialist countries in this field. Ecological USSR versus productivist USA. In view of the socialist camp's obvious lead in the field of ecology and so-called organic agriculture, some will claim, while conceding that the betrayal of the first ecological innovations and the shift to agricultural productivism dates not from the 1950s with Khrushchev's revisionism, but from Stalin's accession to power in the 1920s. This is an aberration that we will correct with concrete evidence to back it up. On the contrary, the 30s and 40s were the heyday of agroecological concepts and practices in the USSR. Not without reason, communists were already criticizing the triumph of capitalist-intensive agriculture in the 1950s, when it was still in its infancy, and enduring the mockery of Western scientists, foremost among them the famous geneticist Jacques Monod. Francis Cohen, for example, a French communist journalist who came to the aid of Soviet agronomy under fierce attack in the West, recalled in 1950, "What good would agrobiology do for the American trusts? What's the point of scientific research that improves the soil from year to year when it is more advantageous in order to cut costs to engage in forced cultivation that destroys and exhausts the soil, turning millions of square kilometers of arable land into deserts? What use to capitalists would genetics be in improving plant and animal species? The aim of agricultural genetics is to create pure, categorizable, standardized varieties that can be sold to farmers with guaranteed characteristics. So-called pure varieties degenerate in 2 or 3 years when grown in the field. So much the better, the country will have to buy seed again." Current events provide excellent and symptomatic illustrations of this last point. For example, in recent years, farmers' trade unionists have been protesting against European legislation aimed at limiting and appropriating seed varieties used in agriculture. In 2013, Jose Bové, an EELV member of parliament and a Confédération Paysanne trade unionist, denounced the European Parliament, the country's agronomic practices at the time, blaming Stalin for the disasters of Chernobyl and the drying of the Aral Sea, both inherited from the Khrushchev, the Virgin Lands campaign, and the Brezhnev periods from the 1960s onward. The new proposal for a seed regulation presented today by the European Commission is counterproductive and dangerous. Numerous scientists and UN agencies such as the FAO are sounding the alarm. Biodiversity is in danger. Multinationals have focused their efforts on the creation of high-yielding plants that are fragile. They can only survive in an artificial environment dependent on chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and therefore on oil. This proposal, which reinforces the stranglehold on the world's 4 major seed monopolies, should instead have been put forward by the lobbyists from Monsanto, Pioneer, and Bayer, to name but a few, who held the pen used to draft this text in the shadows. By reducing farmers' rights to resow their own seeds, tightening the conditions for variety recognition by small independent entrepreneurs, and restricting the circulation and exchange of seeds between associations and growers, the European Commission is sweeping away 10,000 years of agricultural history. The incredible number of plant varieties we have today is based on the selection work of 400 generations of men and women, and on the transmission of this knowledge to the next generation. Plant biodiversity can only be maintained by creating the conditions for a genuine partnership between networks of farmers and agronomists who don't see plants as mere repositories of DNA, but as living beings that evolve over the years, adapting to the new conditions they encounter. Green MP Jose Bové, an anarcho-syndicalist with a reputation for anti-communism, in unison with many of the anti-globalist currents that are regulars in the World Social Forum, the WSF, describes, without naming it, a utopia that only Cuba's socialist society is in the process of concretely realizing today. Why such an omission? Not all that moves is red, not all that is green is sincere. The apparent antagonism antagonisms between sincere environmentalists and communists can easily be reconciled in the short and long term, either by recalling that the very construction of socialism saw the birth and development within it of the first aspirations to protect the environment, or by pointing out that the communist stage, with the extinction of the state, for which socialism is preparing as a transitional phase, will ultimately bring all progressives to agree on a form of production unaffected by the state and its local strategies, rationalized around the real stakes for humanity beyond the class struggle. That is, the protection of the natural resources people need to flourish. What passed for productivism in the post-war socialist countries in the eyes of certain environmental activists was, at least in part, a struggle for survival and against the short-term encirclement of capitalism. When, when the productivism of the capitalist system is clearly part of its quest for maximum profit, there is a transitional tactic in this case of the latter and a strategic choice in the case of the former. In the eyes of communists, on the other hand, the diagnosis of political ecology combines objective elements, such as the petty bourgeois characterization of its militant social base, with more debatable elements of demarcation concerning this notion of productivism. Aware that a necessary political and ideological distinction had to be made between them and social democratic environmentalists, many communists end up positively claiming what they're accused of, for want of any other argument, all the more so at a time when the ideological setbacks, relative historical self-phobia, and loss of ideological bearings in the communist movement are considerable. Such communists would defend the strategic choices of nuclear power or fossil fuels, or even intensive agriculture and its agro-industry, through an unfortunate confusion between Marxism-Leninism and its revisionist Khrushchevian avatar, forgetting that the latter was built by simply pirating the American model. On this point, we need to distinguish between strategic and tactical choices. For what is a strategic choice and a betrayal of Marxism in a country that at one time was the world's industrial leader, like the USSR, must be distinguished from the tactical, transitional choices of peoples fighting for their political and economic independence in times of imperialist war. What's right at one stage of the struggle, such as Lenin's establishment of a new economic program, NEP, in Russia in the early years of the revolution, becomes wrong or even reactionary once the country is in a position to concretely build socialism at a higher stage. Similarly, while socialist Cuba had to make do with fossil fuels supplied by the socialist camp in order to build up its economy in the early years of the revolution in the immediate vicinity of the imperialist giant, the country was later able to make the most of local renewable energies to guarantee its relative energy independence, and thus its freedom to save and redevelop its social model despite the disappearance of the Soviet Big Brother. If a state had just freed itself from the colonial yoke and inherited vast oil resources and the industrial infrastructure to exploit them, and is still unable to invest in other energy resources, can it be blamed for contributing to global carbon pollution? Of what political nature would this reproach be when you think of the decisive impact of global campaigns in support of workers throughout the world, when a people realizes the conditions for its liberation from the imperialist chain of war makers? The hydrocarbon wealth of a semi-colonial country is the object of imperialist covetousness, often not so much for its own supply as to keep it out of the hands of competitors. The USA's oil reserves are assured in Alaska or Texas. France's energy independence is guaranteed by its nuclear industry. But for these powers to ask a semi-colonial country to stop exploiting its oil for supposedly ecological reasons hardly conceals their desire to halt all trade with emerging competing powers such as China or India. The aim is not, however, to idealize the oil-rich origins of the capital that has made it possible to finance a reduction of poverty and illiteracy in a country like Venezuela, for example. Even less to blame it when no other immediate solution can be envisaged, as the country is still largely underdeveloped due to its semi-feudal nature. We have to recognize dialectically the transitory and tactical use of this oil contributes, contrary to its use in imperialist countries and even if the ecological impact is the same to the consolidation of a system which, if it leads to independence and popular emancipation, without which no alternative energy can be exploited with the necessary financial investment. In any case, it's quite clear whether capitalism or socialism, whatever their energy options at the moment, will be better able to overcome the fossil fuel shortage predicted for the coming decades. Only socialist planning can bring about this transition with enough realism and without playing for time, as hypocritical capitalist states do at summit after climate summit. Only the weapon of dialectics allows us to understand that a socialist state sitting on an ocean of underground oil will always be more useful in the long run to the cause of global environmental protection than any capitalist state that has invested massively in renewable energies. Indeed, capital's tactical acumen is well known when it comes to discrediting, demonizing, or paralyzing the adversary. On this condition alone, it's able to invest massively at a loss, provided this investment does not last too long. In this way, imperialism did not hesitate to make the city of West Berlin, on the doorstep of the enemy, East Germany, shine with 1,000 lights in order to arouse the envy of the latter's inhabitants. Today, we know the extent of the crisis in Europe, and it's been a long time since Berlin's neon lights shone only for the local high bourgeoisie. Nor has imperialism hesitated to pull South Korea out of its underdevelopment by infusing it with billions of dollars to no avail in order to discredit the North Korean model, which initially welcomed thousands of economic refugees from the South. On a more local, day-to-day scale, we know how private competitors, as soon as a market opens up, are capable of drastically reducing their prices to economically break the nationalized company before dividing the spoils between two or three of them and raising prices well above those initially charged by the public sector once the latter is out of the picture. Such a psychological trap should no longer mislead anyone. Green capitalism is now contested by sincere environmental activists, even if they remain critical of polluters in the South. Only our international support will enable these countries, once fully sovereign, to emerge from such polluting activities. Certainly not our Western ranting, so opportune for our imperialist bourgeoisie. For their part, many communist activists have forgotten their sense of dialectics and have fallen into the habit of defending energy or agronomic options independently of context, as if a hydrocarbon rich or uranium rich subsoil were essential to guarantee greater social justice. This is a serious confusion between the struggle for national independence, a fundamental condition for social change in a pre-socialist context, and the construction of a society without state, class struggle, or capital nature contradiction in a post-socialist context, which is its logical and necessary outcome, that is, communism. Let's make no mistake about it. The sudden realization in industrialized countries of the harmful effects of carbon dioxide on the climate through conferences such as COP21, for example, is all about one thing: wrapping itself in the angelic wings of ecology to curb as far as possible the development of emerging powers such as China, Russia, Brazil, and India, as well as that of a multitude of smaller countries taking advantage of the opportunities offered by this multipolarization of the world and the consequent weakening of the old Occidental empires. The challenge is all the less costly for our eco-responsible empires in that their massive deindustrialization can progressively remove them from the list of major greenhouse gas emitters, even if they remain the main emitters. Germany, which today prides itself on being the European leader in the development of renewable energies, is still massively dependent on French nuclear power to meet its energy needs and remains Europe's biggest polluter with its colossal coal extractions inherited from the socialist German Democratic Republic. In the days of the GDR, East Germany, on the other hand, fossil fuel production did not clash with its non-consumerist image, which was paradoxically mocked in the West. As in the entire socialist camp, the scarcity of private cars was not a virtue of degrowth, as if everyone had to be satisfied with less, since the well-known development of free public transport, a social as well as an ecological accomplishment, more than met the needs of the Ossis. When eco-socialists and some communist activists become aware of and draw the political conclusions from this necessary distinction between energy provision tactics and strategy, between the complex intricacies of the struggle against capital and the concrete construction of socialism at a higher stage, a major step will have been taken in the general struggle against those truly responsible for global environmental catastrophes. Okay, I got to the end. Let's see if there's any comments. Probably not. Thank you, Kelly. Scheinberg's government in Mexico is providing lots of support to farmers now, including seeds. That's what you get from actually putting experts in your cabinet. Yes, philanstery or philanstery, a self-sustaining cooperative community of the followers of Foyerism. Thank you very much, Kelly. I think that does it for those kinds of things. I'll thank everyone for your attention. I'll leave it to you to demand or not discussions of some of the other chapters. We can have a much broader discussion about this because, of course, there is refutations of various non-communists or pre-communists or anti-communist sort of elements in subsequent chapters. I've left in the thing that I've made available, the reading I've made available, the table of contents, which has a couple of really interesting chapters, particularly if you're interested in specific countries like Cuba or Kurdistan and the USSR. Those of you who really want to get a sense, at least, of one position on Lysenko, which is kind of interesting, actually very interesting, because it's a kind of revisionist view, with all due respect, making an argument for a certain kind of genetics, theory of genetics, which is, in one point of view, problematic, but actually, in the bigger picture, probably not as problematic as we thought. But this is the issue of, well, where does it really truly go? And of course, a handful of crypto Lysenkoists shake up conventional agriculture, which must be a fun chapter. There's a couple of interesting diagrams, profoundly interesting diagrams, with all respect. And so this is a useful viewpoint if you want to give my sort of a very quick review without getting to the end on what this is. On the other hand, it could have used an index, but that sort of works itself out in that particular context. So I will stop the share, stop the live stream, and get back to our